18 days, $2 million. 3 teams of engineers, and the jet still would not move inside the hangar. Standing before the board, CEO Evelyn Hart admitted that if the aircraft failed to fly by morning, the company would lose its largest contract in history. While the experts argued over data nobody understood, Mason, a quiet single father working the night shift, stepped forward and asked for exactly 5 minutes. Several senior engineers laughed. But when he removed one small insulating washer from the engine sensor, the jet roared back to life instantly, and a dangerous conspiracy began to surface. Stay until the very end to discover who truly sabotaged the jet and why Mason was framed as the suspect. The largest hangar at Hartwell Aviation had stayed lit through 18 straight nights, and by the 18th, exhaustion hung over the concrete floor like fog. The Apex X900 sat in the center of that vast space, its engine panels pulled open, wires exposed, diagnostic laptops scattered across rolling carts. The left engine ran clean every time it was tested. The right engine refused to cooperate, aborting its startup sequence again and again the instant it neared a third of its rated speed. Every failed attempt produced a fresh wall of contradictory warnings. Fuel pressure readings dropped without explanation. Engine speed signals jittered erratically. A ground reference voltage flagged as unstable, though nobody could say why. Connor Hayes, the outside engineer hired at emergency rates, stood at the center of it all, convinced the fault lived somewhere inside the new control software, incompatible in some subtle way with the freshly installed sensors. Component after component had been swapped out under his direction, and still nothing changed. The repair costs had already crossed $2 million, a number that made grown executives go quiet when it was spoken aloud. Worse, the international client scheduled to receive the aircraft had made it clear that if the demonstration flight did not happen by morning, the contract would be canceled outright, along with 11 additional jets waiting behind it. Lisa Morgan, chair of the board, arrived at the hangar in person rather than wait for a call, and she gathered the room around her without ceremony. She told Evelyn Hart, the young CEO who had steadied this company through a previous financial collapse, that she had exactly 1 night left. If the aircraft failed to fly, the board would suspend her and begin searching for a buyer. Adrian Blake, the company's operations director, stood near Evelyn as if guarding her, murmuring more than once that selling the company might in the end be the safest path forward for everyone involved. Evelyn turned to Connor and demanded a definite answer. He admitted quietly that he still did not know where the fault lived. While the room argued, a maintenance technician named Mason Reed worked near the right engine, checking a fire suppression line that had nothing to do with the crisis unfolding around him. He heard the fuel cutoff relay click, and something about the timing struck him as wrong. The click came before the engine ever produced a real mechanical shudder, not after. It was the 7th time in 18 days he had noticed that exact sequence, and this time he wrote down the moment precisely. His eyes moved toward the grounding bolt beneath the engine control module, and he noticed a fresh tool mark on its head that had not been there when he inspected that same panel a month earlier. Nobody else in the hangar was looking there. Every expert in the building was staring at screens, chasing numbers that kept lying to them, while the one honest piece of physical evidence sat quietly beneath a panel nobody had thought worth reopening. He also noticed that the paint beneath a nearby washer had never been scratched by any tool, a small detail that suggested the fault had nothing to do with corrosion or ordinary wear. Nobody had asked him a single question in 18 days, and he had not offered an opinion unprompted, preferring instead to keep his own record until he was certain of what he was seeing. When Evelyn finally said aloud that this fault made no sense, that it defied every explanation her team could offer, Mason understood something the entire room had missed for 18 days. They had been searching in the wrong place the whole time, chasing a phantom inside the software while the real answer sat untouched, hidden in plain sight beneath a single bolt that nobody with a laptop had bothered to examine. Mason had worked at Hartwell Aviation for nearly 2 years, and to his coworkers he was simply the quiet one, careful to a fault, a man who had never once signed off on an aircraft he did not fully trust. None of the leadership knew that he had once been a reliability engineer specializing in jet engine control systems, a career he had walked away from after losing his wife. He had chosen the night shift deliberately because it let him build a stable routine for his son, and one brief call home that evening was the only place the boy was mentioned at all, a quick promise from Mason that he would be home once his shift ended. Across those 18 days, Mason had quietly kept his own private log. He noted the exact moment each startup began, the precise speed at which the fault appeared, the order in which the relays clicked open and shut, the particular sound the fuel pump made under strain, and the true vibration signature of the engine itself. Every entry pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The electrical fault was arriving before any mechanical symptom ever developed, which meant the computer was reacting correctly to information that was already false. He brought this observation to Connor, who asked, not unkindly but pointedly, whether Mason held any formal certification for the Apex control systems. Mason answered that the basic principle behind an electrical ground connection did not change depending on how expensive the aircraft happened to be. Connor dismissed the idea anyway, noting that every sensor in that circuit had already been replaced. Mason suggested, simply, that someone measure the voltage difference between the control module and the engine body itself, a 5-minute test that nobody had performed. Before Connor could respond, Adrian appeared and ordered Mason back to his assigned duties, remarking that the company did not pay engineers a small fortune per hour to take instruction from a night shift mechanic. Jackson Cole, the hangar's safety manager, witnessed the exchange but said nothing, caught between what he had seen Mason do before and what he feared losing if he spoke up now. Mason let it go and returned to the maintenance records instead, paging carefully through the technical documentation for anything he might have missed. There, he discovered that the page detailing the required electrical bonding check had vanished from the current manual entirely. The page numbering jumped straight from 112 to 114, and the revision history showed the change had been approved through Adrian's own office. Mason was not yet ready to call this sabotage. What he was certain of was that the engineering team was skipping the single most important verification step in the entire troubleshooting process, and doing so without realizing it. Connor, meanwhile, was preparing to recommend a full engine removal, a process that would take weeks and guarantee the loss of the contract regardless of what was eventually found. Jackson watched the exchange unfold from a distance, torn between the loyalty he felt toward Mason and the fear of losing his own position if he spoke up in his defense. He said nothing that night, though the memory of every quiet moment Mason had once prevented a smaller problem from becoming a larger one stayed with him, unspoken, for the rest of the evening. It was against that backdrop, with despair settling over the hangar and the clock counting down toward morning, that Mason finally walked out into the open floor and told Evelyn directly that he needed exactly 5 minutes to get that engine running. The hangar went quiet in a way it had not been in days. A few engineers laughed openly, certain the night shift mechanic was simply chasing attention in front of the crisis that had consumed everyone else. Connor asked, with an edge in his voice, whether Mason understood they had already replaced components worth hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to solve this. Mason answered plainly that they had replaced everything except the one thing actually causing the fault. Adrian called for security to remove him from the floor, but Evelyn raised a hand and stopped it before it started. She asked Mason what he needed. He requested a safe power isolation around the engine bay, direct access to the control module, and an agreement that nobody would energize the system until he had cleared the danger area himself. Connor was assigned to supervise every step. Adrian warned loudly that Mason had no authority to modify a certified system, and Mason answered that he was not modifying the design at all, only restoring a connection that someone had already tampered with. Evelyn checked her watch and granted him exactly 5 minutes. Connor began timing it aloud. Mason used a small meter to confirm the voltage discrepancy he had suspected for days. He loosened the grounding connection at the base of the control module, and beneath the bolt, a thin, clear polymer washer slid free into his palm, a component that had no place in that engine's original design at all. He held it up so Connor could see the untouched paint beneath the contact point, proof that current had never been able to pass cleanly through that joint the entire time. Current simply could not move steadily across an insulated surface, no matter how many sensors surrounded it. He removed the washer, cleaned the contact surface by hand, and reseated the grounding connection to the exact standard the manual called for. He finished with less than a minute remaining on the clock, and Connor, still skeptical, muttered that the fix looked far too simple to matter. Mason asked for a controlled ground startup sequence to be run immediately, and the electrical systems came alive around them. The engine began to turn. Speed climbed steadily upward, 15%, then 25, then 30, then 32, and the entire hangar seemed to hold its breath waiting for the warning that had haunted this aircraft for 18 days. For the first time since the crisis began, the engine passed 32% without incident. The fuel valve stayed open, pressure held steady. The engine settled into a smooth, ordinary idle, and the sound of a working jet engine filled the hangar for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. Engineers stood frozen. Evelyn stared at the display, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had been told for 18 straight days. Mason did not celebrate. He simply sealed the washer inside an evidence bag, calm as if he had just finished an ordinary night of work. Connor checked the material code stamped faintly on the washer and confirmed it had no business existing at that location under any legitimate specification. Adrian immediately suggested that a careless technician had simply installed the wrong part by accident. Mason pointed out that the location sat buried behind a protective panel, in a place nobody would stumble across without specifically knowing how to feed the flight computer false information without destroying the engine itself. Whoever placed that washer there had understood the system intimately. Standing before the entire assembled board, Mason stated plainly that this aircraft had not failed by accident. It had been deliberately sabotaged, and the person responsible clearly understood these systems well enough to make that sabotage nearly invisible for 18 days. A hush settled over the hangar as the weight of that statement sank in, and even Lisa, usually unmoved by dramatic claims, said nothing for a long moment before finally asking Mason how he intended to prove it. The engine held steady through repeated ground testing, and the international client agreed to delay any cancellation decision by 1 more day. Lisa postponed the vote to suspend Evelyn, at least for the moment. Evelyn immediately ordered an internal investigation, and Mason walked the room through his reasoning step by step. Connor confirmed that the technical data supported every part of it. The warning had consistently appeared before any real mechanical shift occurred, which meant the computer had been reacting to falsified information from the very beginning. Evelyn asked why nobody had brought this to her directly. Mason told her he had filed 2 separate reports, and neither had ever reached the executive office. Adrian deflected the blame toward middle management, framing what looked like deliberate suppression as nothing more than an administrative oversight. Grace Turner, the company's internal auditor, had already begun reviewing the $2 million spent on repairs, and she quickly found that several components had been purchased through 3 newly formed vendor companies at prices 3 to 5 times above market value. Some of those parts, she discovered, had never actually been installed on the aircraft at all. Jackson pulled the hangar security footage and found that recordings from the night before the fault first appeared had been erased entirely, logged by the system as routine automated maintenance. Mason examined the polymer washer more closely and noticed a distinctive triangular along its edge, a mark consistent with a rapid prototyping tool found only in a restricted fabrication room, one accessible after hours to a small handful of senior staff. Adrian began quietly steering suspicion toward Mason instead, asking aloud how an ordinary mechanic understood so precisely how to create a fault like this one. He reminded the room, more than once, that Mason had access to the aircraft alone during the overnight shift. Evelyn did not believe Mason was responsible, not truly, but she felt bound by procedure regardless. She asked for his access badge to be temporarily suspended pending review. Mason accepted the decision without argument, though he warned her plainly that the person responsible for this sabotage was standing far closer to her than she currently believed. The evidence bag containing the washer was logged and carried into the secure evidence room, and Adrian watched the entire process unfold from a distance without a word. Grace, working quietly on her own review, cross-referenced every purchase order against the actual maintenance logs and found several parts billed twice under slightly different names, a pattern far too consistent to be simple clerical error. Jackson mentioned, almost in passing, that Adrian had personally requested the restricted fabrication room be reopened for an unscheduled task roughly 3 weeks earlier, right around the time the original fault first appeared. Evelyn asked to see the original request, and Adrian claimed he no longer remembered the specific reason behind it. Mason, listening quietly from the side of the room, noted privately that a man who controlled every layer of approval rarely needed to remember his own justifications, since no one above him was ever positioned to ask. That night, the evidence bag disappeared from its locked storage, and the electronic access log showed, unmistakably, that Mason's own badge had opened the storage room door. It was a piece of evidence that arrived far too cleanly, far too conveniently, at the exact moment suspicion had already begun turning in his direction, and it would set in motion a far more dangerous chapter than anyone in that hangar yet understood. Mason was called into a security meeting room the following morning, where the access log showed his badge opening the evidence room at 2:13 in the morning. Hallway footage captured a figure in a maintenance uniform, though the face stayed carefully out of frame the entire time. The washer itself was simply gone. To make matters worse, an unexplained payment had appeared in Mason's bank account, traced back to one of the very shell vendor companies that had sold Hartwell those overpriced replacement parts. Adrian built his theory carefully and presented it as though it were obvious. Mason, he suggested, had deliberately created the original fault, waited until the company was desperate enough, staged a dramatic public repair to appear heroic, accepted a payment from a fraudulent supplier, and then stole back the evidence before anyone could examine it closely. Mason denied every part of it and asked instead that someone verify the original door access records rather than trust the electronic log alone. Adrian insisted the digital trail already spoke for itself. Evelyn asked Mason where he had been at the moment the evidence room was opened. He had been driving home after his shift, with no witness who could confirm it directly. Mason never leaned on his situation as a single father to earn sympathy in that room. He simply pointed out, calmly, that data could be duplicated and that access badges could be cloned by anyone with the right equipment. Under mounting pressure from the board, Evelyn suspended him, though she stopped short of authorizing an arrest while the evidence remained incomplete. Mason looked at her and asked why a saboteur would ever publicly explain in perfect technical detail exactly how he had broken the aircraft in the first place. Evelyn had no answer for that. Mason was escorted out of the hangar, and as he left, Jackson quietly handed him a printed copy of the mechanical key log, which showed the evidence room had actually been opened with a physical key well before Mason's badge was ever scanned. Only 3 people held that key: Jackson himself, Evelyn, and Adrian. Jackson's key remained sealed in its case. Evelyn's key sat locked inside her personal safe. Grace, meanwhile, traced the suspicious deposit in Mason's account and found it had been created only 10 minutes after the evidence disappeared, a timing far too precise to be coincidence. Evelyn reviewed the footage of Mason's repair once more and noticed something she had missed the first time. He had walked directly to the grounding point without hesitation, showing no sign of random searching at all, which meant he must have reasoned his way to that exact location days earlier through careful observation alone. At that very moment, a fresh warning appeared on the system, this time pointing to a fault in the right flap, arriving just hours before the demonstration flight was scheduled to happen. Grace, unwilling to accept the badge log at face value, requested the raw building access data directly from the security vendor rather than the summary report Adrian had already circulated to the board. The 2 versions did not match. Connor, for his part, quietly ran a second check on the payment traced to Mason and noticed the transfer had originated from an account created only days earlier, with no prior transaction history of any kind. It was the kind of detail a careful auditor would notice and a hurried one would miss entirely. Standing outside the airport gate afterward, Mason received a single anonymous message on his phone. It told him plainly that he had fixed something that was never meant to be fixed. Sitting in his car afterward, Mason paged slowly through photographs he had taken of the maintenance receipts over the past weeks. He noticed that a striking number of components had been replaced despite historical records showing they were functioning perfectly well beforehand. Every one of those purchase approvals had passed through Adrian's office without exception. Grace reached out to him quietly, still not entirely certain she trusted him, but needing someone who could explain the part numbers on the invoices in front of her. Mason confirmed that a large share of the equipment listed on those bills did not even belong to the Apex line of aircraft at all. The company had paid for items that had never actually been installed anywhere. Grace followed the paper trail to 3 separate suppliers, each registered to nothing more than a virtual office address, and eventually traced the ultimate ownership of those companies back to a relative connected directly to Adrian. Evelyn arranged a private meeting with Grace and Mason away from the rest of the staff, and she apologized to him for suspending him before the full picture had been examined. Mason told her, without bitterness, that an apology alone was not enough. The company's own procedures had allowed someone in a position of authority to bury warnings and silence the voice of an ordinary worker for 18 days straight. Evelyn accepted the criticism without pushing back. Together, the 3 of them laid out everything they now understood: the missing inspection page, the disabled security footage, the washer fabricated inside a restricted room, the inflated repair invoices, the cloned access badge, and the deposit planted in Mason's account to make him appear guilty. Grace then discovered that Hartwell was carrying a loan with an unusual condition attached to it. If the demonstration flight failed to happen before the 21st day, the lender held the right to force a painful restructuring of the company's entire debt. A rival company called Nexara Aerospace, she learned, had quietly purchased a portion of that very loan. If Hartwell defaulted, Nexara would be positioned to force a takeover of the company at a fraction of its true value. Adrian, it turned out, had already signed a future consulting agreement with a firm closely tied to Nexara, one that promised him millions of dollars once the acquisition was finalized. By now it was the 19th day, and the newly discovered flap fault had clearly been engineered to buy another 2 days of delay. Mason noticed the same telltale pattern in the warning, arriving before any real mechanical movement occurred, exactly as before. A small signal simulator, he suspected, had likely been wired directly into the data line itself. Evelyn wanted to bring this immediately to the board, but Grace warned that Adrian would erase every trace of evidence the moment he sensed they were closing in. Mason proposed setting a trap instead. Hartwell would announce publicly that the demonstration flight would proceed exactly as scheduled on the morning of the 21st day, forcing Adrian into one final act of sabotage under pressure. Jackson would quietly install an independent camera system disconnected from the company network. Grace would monitor every financial transaction and server access attempt in real time. Mason would return to the property, officially reinstated as a safety consultant reporting directly to the CEO. Adrian seethed at the decision but could not openly object without drawing suspicion onto himself. Evelyn spent that same evening reviewing every safety report filed over the past year, searching for other warnings that might have been quietly buried the same way hers had been. She found 3, each one minor on its own, each one dismissed without explanation by the same office that had dismissed Mason's original findings. It left her with an uneasy sense that the 18 days of crisis had exposed a pattern far older than the sabotage itself. Alone in his private office that night, Adrian logged into a hidden administrative account and began quietly preparing what he intended to be his final move. Evelyn announced that the demonstration flight would proceed exactly as scheduled, with both the client's representative and the board watching in person. Adrian pushed to postpone it, citing the flap fault, and Mason confirmed that the mechanical structure of the flap itself was not damaged in any way. An unauthorized module was simply feeding false position information into the system. Mason chose not to remove the device immediately. Instead, he marked its location and watched carefully, waiting to see whether anyone returned to interfere with it further. Jackson installed the independent camera system entirely outside the company's internal network. Grace copied the financial records onto an offline drive where nothing could be quietly altered afterward. Evelyn pretended to still trust Adrian completely, assigning him nominal responsibility over the flight schedule so he would believe his interference remained undetected. Mason inspected the entire aircraft methodically, moving through the flap mechanism, the fuel system, the engine controls, the door sensors, the avionics suite, and the ground control interface one component at a time. He located an unauthorized transmitter hidden near the flap data line, a small device capable of convincing the flight computer that the 2 flaps were dangerously out of alignment with each other. Left in place, that false signal would have caused the aircraft to refuse takeoff entirely. Mason neutralized the dangerous effect while leaving the physical device itself untouched, preserving it as evidence. He placed safety above the satisfaction of catching anyone in the act. Connor was brought partially into the plan and apologized to Mason for having dismissed him so quickly days earlier. Mason told him plainly that they needed to focus on protecting the flight first and worry about pride afterward. Adrian met privately with Mason and offered him a substantial sum of money to simply leave the company quietly. Mason asked why an innocent man would ever need to be paid for his silence. Adrian shifted his tone, calling it a fair settlement instead, and mentioned that Mason had a family depending on him. Mason answered coldly that Adrian was not to speak of his family again, and Adrian understood in that instant that Mason could not be bought at any price. On the morning of the 21st day, the Apex X900 was towed out of the hangar while the client, the board, and hundreds of employees gathered at the observation area. Both engines started cleanly. The flap inspection passed without incident. For a brief moment, everything appeared to be working exactly as it should. Behind the scenes, Grace had spent the previous night quietly rebuilding the timeline of every falsified purchase order, matching each one against the exact dates the fabrication room had been accessed after hours. The pattern lined up almost perfectly with the 18 days of failed repairs, suggesting the sabotage and the financial scheme had been planned together as a single operation from the very beginning rather than two separate acts. Jackson, meanwhile, positioned his independent recording equipment to cover every entrance to the secondary control room, certain that whoever had reached in electronically once would try again before the flight actually happened. Grace noticed the hidden administrative account log in again at that exact moment. Jackson traced the signal directly back to a secondary ground control room. Adrian was nowhere near the position he had been assigned to occupy. As the aircraft began to taxi forward, a warning suddenly appeared on the cockpit display indicating that the left brake system had lost pressure entirely. The pilot brought the aircraft to an immediate stop, and because it was still moving at low speed, no real danger of collision existed yet. The left brake indicator kept falling steadily. Adrian had shifted his approach, moving from causing delay toward manufacturing a genuinely alarming failure directly in front of the client. Connor called for a complete system shutdown. Mason, watching closely, noticed that the actual mechanical pressure gauge held perfectly steady the entire time, which meant the fault existed only on the electronic data line, not in the physical brake system itself. He asked the pilot to hold the aircraft exactly where it was. Airport fire crews took their positions as standard procedure required. Mason approached an external diagnostic panel and found a falsified signal being injected into the data network from the very device he had left hidden earlier. He switched the system into ground test mode and isolated the compromised line entirely. The brake indicator returned to normal almost instantly. The entire event, from the first warning to full resolution, lasted roughly 30 seconds. Jackson traced the controlling signal back to a secondary control room. The independent camera captured Adrian walking directly into that very room, his administrative account still logged in and active on the terminal inside. Grace discovered Adrian attempting, at that very moment, to delete the fraudulent invoices along with the consulting agreement tied to Nexara. Evelyn ordered the internal network isolated immediately. Adrian appeared at the server room and insisted he was simply trying to protect company data from corruption. A faint residue of polymer dust clung to his sleeve, matching the material found inside the restricted fabrication room. Jackson recovered footage showing Adrian removing a small washer from that very room days earlier. Connor located the edit history on the maintenance documentation and confirmed that Adrian's own account had deleted the bonding inspection page from the manual. Grace recovered an email discussing a payment scheduled to arrive only after the acquisition was completed. Adrian continued to deny everything, suggesting weakly that his own account must have been copied by someone else entirely. Lisa called an emergency vote on the spot, and the board suspended every one of Adrian's access privileges immediately. Adrian tried to physically remove the server's storage drive before security intervened and stopped him, calmly and without incident. Facing Evelyn directly, Adrian finally admitted that he believed Hartwell was weak and destined to be acquired eventually regardless of what he did, and that he had simply chosen to stand on the side he believed would win. Mason told him plainly that he had not saved his own future at all. He had only sold the future belonging to thousands of other people. Lisa, standing nearby, asked Adrian directly whether anyone else at Hartwell had been involved in the scheme. Adrian insisted he had acted entirely on his own, a claim Grace would later spend weeks verifying against every account, invoice, and login record the company could recover. Evelyn ordered a full external audit regardless, unwilling to assume the damage stopped with a single person simply because he said so. Connor volunteered to assist that audit without charge, saying it was the least he could do after doubting the one person in the hangar who had been right from the very beginning. The client's representative wanted to cancel the flight entirely after witnessing the brake failure firsthand. Evelyn did not pressure anyone. She explained openly that the aircraft had been deliberately tampered with, but that the fault had been caught safely while the plane remained firmly on the ground. Mason insisted that nobody would be permitted to take off until an independent verification of every system had been completed in full. Connor offered to work directly under Mason's supervision for the remainder of the process. They divided the work between them. Connor analyzed the digital data streams. Mason inspected the physical systems by hand. Jackson verified every point of security. Grace locked down each suspicious account across the network. Together they discovered 2 additional unauthorized modules that had never been activated at all. The devices were removed and sealed as evidence. The entire brake system was tested repeatedly from start to finish. The flaps were cycled through their full range many times over. Both engines completed testing across a wide range of power settings, and not a single false warning appeared again. The lead pilot confirmed personally that the aircraft was fully fit to attempt the test flight. Evelyn asked the technical team directly whether they were willing to sign off on it, refusing to use her authority as chief executive to pressure anyone into agreement. Mason signed last after everyone else. The Apex X900 rolled out onto the runway once more, and this time every system held perfectly steady. The engines gained speed smoothly. The wheels lifted cleanly off the pavement. After 18 days of failure, the jet finally climbed into open sky. It completed a full sequence of tests in the air, adjusting altitude, cycling the flaps, running the engines through varying levels of power, and simulating an approach back toward the airport. The aircraft returned safely to Chicago without incident. The client agreed to honor the full contract, worth nearly $1 billion. Lisa confirmed that Hartwell had avoided the painful debt restructuring clause entirely. Workers across the hangar broke into applause the moment the jet rolled back inside, a sound that carried through the building, louder than any of the warning alarms that had haunted it for the past 3 weeks. Evelyn called Mason forward in front of the entire staff. She admitted openly that the company had not nearly failed because it lacked money. It had nearly failed because its leadership had refused, for far too long, to listen to the people who worked closest to the aircraft every single day. Connor added, without prompting, that there had been no miracle involved in those 5 minutes at all. Mason had simply observed carefully for many days and tested the one theory everyone else had been too proud to check. Adrian was handed over to investigators facing likely charges of fraud, sabotage of aviation property, unauthorized system intrusion, and falsification of company records, though the legal process itself had only just begun. Grace announced that the frozen accounts tied to the shell vendor companies were already being reviewed by federal authorities, and Lisa confirmed the board intended to pursue full restitution rather than treat the matter as a private settlement. As the celebration continued around him, Mason quietly gathered his tools and packed them away, moving with the same steady calm as if he had simply finished an ordinary night of routine maintenance. Evelyn invited Mason into her office privately the following week. On her desk sat a formal offer naming him Director of Reliability and Technical Safety, a role carrying a substantial salary, a share of company equity, direct authority to ground any aircraft he judged unsafe, and a reporting line straight to both the chief executive and the board itself. Mason did not sign it right away. He told her that Adrian alone had never been the whole problem. The conspiracy had succeeded for 18 days, he explained, because frontline workers were never truly listened to. Because reports were quietly blocked as they moved upward through layer after layer of management, because outside experts were trusted without question, and because a single individual had been allowed to control procurement, documentation, and access all at once. Mason laid out his own conditions in return. He wanted a direct safety reporting pathway that could not be intercepted along the way. He wanted genuine protection for anyone who raised a legitimate warning in good faith. He wanted every software change verified against the physical system before it was ever trusted. He wanted design engineers sitting in the same room as mechanics and pilots on a regular basis. He wanted no single person holding control over every layer of security at once. He wanted every outside vendor and component audited on an ongoing schedule going forward. Evelyn agreed to every point without hesitation. Grace was appointed to lead a newly independent compliance division. Jackson was promoted to safety director for the entire hangar operation. Connor sought Mason out personally and apologized once more. Mason told him the mistake had never been reaching the wrong conclusion in the first place. The real mistake had been refusing to test a reasonable theory simply because the person offering it held no impressive title. Connor offered to help design the new inspection procedures without charging the company an additional fee for his time. Evelyn later gathered the entire staff together, choosing to stand on the hangar floor itself rather than on any stage above them. She told her employees plainly that she took full responsibility for what had happened, and she promised that from that point forward, every safety warning would be evaluated on evidence alone, regardless of who raised it or what position they held. Mason signed the contract only after every one of the reform conditions had been formally written into it. He accepted the offer as fair recognition of real technical value, not as a favor granted from above, and he made that distinction clear to Evelyn before he ever picked up a pen to sign anything at all. He left the office that day carrying a new badge, one that allowed him to halt any flight at any time the moment he believed genuine safety was at risk. Grace, settling into her new role over the following weeks, established a rotating audit schedule that required every vendor relationship above a modest threshold to be independently reviewed twice a year going forward. Jackson rewrote the hangar's security protocols so that no single key or badge could ever again grant unsupervised access to both the evidence room and the restricted fabrication space at once. The changes were quiet, procedural, and unglamorous, exactly the kind of reform that rarely made headlines, but that made a repeat of the last 18 days far less likely to occur again. 6 months later, Hartwell Aviation delivered its third Apex X900 exactly on schedule, and the billion-dollar contract stayed fully intact. Investigators had traced and frozen most of the money that had quietly vanished during those 18 chaotic days. Adrian faced formal charges alongside the operators behind the shell vendor companies, and the legal proceedings against them were still ongoing. Mason built an entirely new inspection process, one that combined electronic diagnostic data with careful hands-on physical verification at every step. Every new hire in the maintenance division now spent their first week learning to recognize the exact kind of subtle mismatch that had nearly cost Hartwell everything, and Mason personally reviewed each trainee's notes before certifying them for solo work on any aircraft. Mechanics were finally invited to sit in on technical planning meetings alongside engineers. Pilots, engineers, and maintenance staff now reviewed every serious warning together as equals before any conclusion was reached. Connor returned to Hartwell as part of a shared training program, and Evelyn regularly attended those sessions herself, choosing to sit among the trainees rather than above them. Inside the training room stood a single glass case holding one small polymer washer, displayed not to honor Mason personally, but to remind everyone who walked past it that one tiny detail had once been enough to deceive a system worth many millions of dollars. When the training session ended for the day, Mason left the airfield right on time, keeping his promise to share dinner with his son that evening. The boy never appeared in any of these events directly, and that quiet detail said everything about why Mason valued his time, his responsibilities, and the safety of others so deeply. Evelyn stood near the hangar entrance and watched another Apex X900 lift smoothly into the evening sky. She thought back to the $2 million the company had once spent across 18 desperate days without finding a single real answer. What had actually saved Hartwell was never the most expensive part on the shelf. It was 5 minutes finally given to a man who had been watching closely enough, for long enough, and who had simply never been given the chance to be heard. The lesson stayed with her long after the jet disappeared into the darkening sky, a quiet reminder that the smallest details and the quietest voices were often the ones that mattered most of all, a lesson she promised herself never to forget again. What saved Hartwell Aviation was never the most expensive part on any shelf. It was 5 quiet minutes finally given to a man who had spent 18 days watching, measuring, and thinking long after everyone else had given up and gone home. Mason never wanted recognition. He wanted the truth to be tested, not dismissed because of who happened to be speaking it. Every leader in that hangar learned the same hard lesson. Warnings ignored are never warnings solved, only warnings delayed until the cost grows too large to survive. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes that quiet people rarely have the loudest answers. Sometimes the person nobody notices is the only one who was ever truly paying attention.